and welcome to Always Take Notes.
Hello listeners, you may remember that a few months ago we made some improvements to our Patreon offering, refreshing our package of successful pitches for people who support Always Take Notes. Since then, we've been so delighted to see more people join up. We've loved hearing from you about how useful you found the package and the podcast, but we're really keen to keep expanding the benefits available to all the people who support us.
So with that in mind, we've added 40 new pages of material to the package, including pitches to the New York Times, the Washington Post and the BBC. This means the whole compendium now runs to a whopping 160 pages. And we're excited to announce that for people who contribute $10 a month, we're also going to start releasing bonus mini episodes. If you'd like to know what these will sound like, there's a sample episode with Lee Child that you can listen to for free on our Patreon now.
Thanks to the help of our sponsor, Scrivener, the first 10 new sign-ups at $10 per month will receive a lifelong license to Scrivener worth £55. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects such as novels, academic papers and even scripts. We're now down to 8 of them left, so if you're interested, check it out as soon as you can.
These are just a few of the updates we've made to our Patreon offering. So if you'd like to find out more about how to get your hands on an ATN mug, suggest questions for upcoming guests, or join a monthly call with us to workshop a pitch, head to www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes. That's www.patreon.com/alwaystakenotes.
And thanks so much again for all your support so far.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the journalist and author Ben Macintyre.
We spoke to Ben about his work as a journalist for The Times, about his success with books including Operation Mincemeat, A Spy Among Friends and Rogue Heroes, and about his latest title, The Siege.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Ben, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. We wanted to start with your new book, The Siege. As you point out yourself, there's been an awful lot written about the Iranian embassy siege already, and there have been films and stuff like that. What was your decision and your motivation to come at this subject in particular?
Well, twofold, really. One was that I wrote an authorised history of the wartime SAS a few years ago, getting on for 12 years ago now. And that was both very good fun and a completely new experience for me because I'd never worked with authorization before. I was a little alarmed about it at the time. But in fact, the SAS were brilliant. They just opened up their secret archive and let me tromp my way through it for months. And it was wonderful. But at the end of that conversation and that production and that book, I said to them, look, I would love to write about the Iranian embassy siege because I remember it vividly as a child when I was 17, watching it live. They broke away from the snooker, which I was actually watching, in order to do the sort of live footage of the siege. And it was incredible. And I'd always wanted to write about it. But it's one of those stories that has been so heavily mythologized over the years. Not least by people who claimed to have taken part in it, who did not. There is an old joke within the SAS, which is that if everyone who claimed to have been involved in the Iranian embassy siege had actually been involved in the Iranian embassy siege, the balcony would have fallen off at the front because there would have been so many people on it. In fact, there were very few people involved in that siege, as I discovered when I was researching it. And I guess so that was really what I really wanted to do was take this story that was so much part of my childhood, so much part of the SAS, so kind of central to the kind of Thatcherite symbolism and mythology, and try and actually see, if I could, to get as close to the reality as possible. And that was really made possible by the fact that the MOD gave authorization for the surviving participants, the SAS soldiers who'd taken part in the final assault, to speak to me. And they'd never done that before. And that was a sort of break with tradition, really. And it took a certain amount of negotiation, and there was a certain amount of anxiety on both sides, actually. But I think for the surviving, there are only about 18 of them left now, the people who actually took part in it. It was rather a cathartic experience, I think. They were allowed to finally tell their stories in full. Because as your listeners will know, the SAS is a strange organization that is both incredibly famous and intensely secretive. And that's a sort of tension that exists in the heart of SAS operations, which is that they are a household name and have been ever since the Iranian embassy siege, but they're not really supposed to talk about what they do. So this was a break with tradition, which I think actually the regiment looks on as having been a success.
When you mentioned those negotiations with the MOD, what did they involve?
Well, it was all done at sort of arm's length, really. It was really a question of the individuals applying for something called an EPAW. Everything in military life has an acronym attached to it. So that's Express Prior Authorization in Writing, an EPAW, which allowed them then to speak openly. So they had to do the applying. I didn't. Um, but they were incredibly helpful, and many of them really wanted to do it.
And what was the trade from the military side? I mean, did they get to see the manuscript before it was published?
No, absolutely not. No, I wouldn't do that. I mean, I had SAS advisors who were around to kind of tell me if I was going over a line. So if I was in any way jeopardizing national security or revealing techniques, what they call contemporary ability, then that had to come out. And I completely understand that. There's no way I would have wanted to make life any easier for terrorists to carry out hostage taking operations. So I didn't mind that at all. But there was no formal agreement. There was no, and I wouldn't want to do that. I mean, otherwise, you end up sort of in a complicated position. The authorized book on the SAS was slightly different, actually, because in that case, since it was actually authorized, it wasn't an official book, but they had given me authority. They did read the manuscript before, and that was fine too. They're actually, in a way, they're rather sort of hands off with this sort of stuff. Once it's written, they kind of don't tend to muck around with it.
And am I right in thinking as well that there are four other unpublished accounts that were important in terms of your interest in taking this project on?
Well, I only discovered those, Rachel, when I was writing the book, and I was amazed by how many people at the time or immediately afterwards had written their own accounts. They never published them, but they wanted to keep a kind of record of what had happened, which gives you an idea of just how important that event was in these people's lives. So not only did the senior police officer at the scene, the commissioner who actually ran the siege, he kept his own notes in his own diary. Then there were two of the hostages who had written their own accounts. One of them, a Syrian journalist called Mustafa Karkuti, who was the only person who could speak all three languages inside the embassy. So he spoke English, Arabic, and Farsi. So he played a crucial role. He wrote a 410-page book after the event. He never published it. I don't think he ever really intended to publish it, but it's an incredible account. I mean, it gives you a sort of minute by minute description of what he had done and what he had seen and who he had spoken to, written within weeks, as I understand it, of his getting out. So that was gold dust. And then there was Sim Harris, who was the BBC guy, one of the BBC guys who was in there, who was there throughout the siege, right from beginning to end. He kept a handwritten diary, actually contemporaneously. So he was drawing little stick figures of the gunmen and his fellow hostages and what he was seeing while it was going on. For a non-fiction writer, that stuff is absolutely gold dust. That's about as good as you can get when you've got a contemporaneous handwritten diary that has never been seen before. That's the sort of that's goosebump territory.
I thought it was very interesting as well the role of Peter de la Billière, who was director. They might have changed the name of the role, but Director Special Forces at the time. But then, as you point out, and I know a bit about this from my own book on the army, that he then kind of opened the floodgates to the SAS book. After the First Gulf War, and the version of that I remember being told was that he had lost money in the Lloyd's of London insurance issue, and that he wanted to kind of monetize that. But the fundamental tension that evolved in the 1990s was that the regiment was very wary of this sort of gush of publishing, but at the same time it had been instigated by the sort of top of the hierarchy itself.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the more controversial elements. It's not to do with my book. And Peter, who's very much still around, was incredibly helpful. But that was a very controversial moment. Yes, he wrote his memoirs. I don't know. It is said that's why he needed the money. I don't know whether he needed the money or why, but it was a successful book. It was the first by anyone from the SAS top brass to have done this. And there was, I think, a general feeling that he'd broken ranks because while the officers were going to be allowed to get away with it and make money, the troopers, the people lower down, were felt that they were being told they were not allowed to do this sort of thing, and he got into big trouble. I think he was PNG'd by the regiment for a considerable period. He's now very much Grata again, or Grata, whatever. I don't know what the reverse of PNG is, but he's certainly back in the fold. but that was highly controversial. But it illustrates an interesting point, I think, which is that before the Iranian embassy siege happened, the SAS was virtually unknown. I mean, they were a really shadowy unit. I mean, they'd had a very distinguished wartime history, but nobody knew it. 99 people out of 100 in this country had never heard of the SAS. That changed absolutely overnight. And from the moment this thing ended, as Peter de la Billière himself put it, young men were queuing up outside recruitment centers saying, give me a balaclava and a machine gun, and I'll go and do this myself. And of course, that's not how you get into the SAS. But nonetheless, it created a tension. And Michael Rose, who was the commanding officer of SA 22 SAS when it happened, says that he believes that the Iranian embassy siege was one of the worst things that ever happened to the regiment because it suddenly thrust them into the limelight. And this enduring tension between being very well known, being extremely famous, but also trying to operate in secrecy is still happening today. It is central to the issue that the SAS faces, which is that you cannot do secret operations in the limelight. It doesn't work that way.
I wanted to ask what it was like writing about an event that took place over such a compressed time period compared with the experience of writing your other books. I mean, did it feel different, or was it similar because you're touching on those bigger themes, as you mentioned, of the SAS public role and perception and things like that?
I loved it. I loved that I had this completely contained theatre, if you like. I mean, in a way, not only did it take place over just 6 days, almost all of it takes place in one room. And that's an opportunity to create real tension, because particularly when you've got the conversations going on and you know what those conversations are between the people in that room, that's a really intense and intensifying way of writing nonfiction. You can particularly the last 11 minutes of the story, which are Operation Nimrod itself, which is the assault that actually took place on the building. That only lasted 11 minutes. That, as I think I put this in the book, that's as long as it takes to cook a hard-boiled egg. And yet into those 11 minutes, I was able, I hope, to compress the tension and the many different voices and the many different areas on which that was taking place. So this is by far the sort of, as it were, the most textured and detailed and closely observed book that I've ever written, just simply because that's the way the material works on this story. It is 6 days that boil down in the end to 11 minutes. But as you say, it is also part of a much broader context story, which is about international terrorism. It's about the Iranian Revolution. It's about irredentist movements within Iran. It goes back thousands of years, if you like, but that's in a way why I love it. You go from this huge, broad focus into something very, very narrow indeed when I'm trying to tell the story not just hour by hour, not even minute by minute, but actually sort of second by second.
I was very interested in the kind of psychological games that you describe, and games in a kind of technical sense. And I was aware of Stockholm Syndrome, but Lima Syndrome was something I had not encountered before. But I thought this idea that the kind of strategy that a hostage negotiator takes is to claim you're an honest broker in the middle, prevaricate, but don't actually offer anything, can have this effect of actually bonding the people inside the captives and the captors together. So you see that with Sim Harris. I thought that was something I wasn't familiar with, but I wondered when was that playbook as to how you run a negotiation established? Was that post Munich, or does it go a lot further back than that?
I think it probably does go further back, but the moment when governments really focused on how to deal with standoff situations like this was after the Munich massacre, which had gone so appallingly badly wrong. It'd been mishandled more or less from the beginning. So from that point on, Western governments had negotiators on hand. I mean, one shouldn't exaggerate it. I mean, the level of training that the 6 police negotiators had in this case was pretty minimal. I mean, it wasn't really strategized. It was much more tactical. It was sort of, how do we keep this going moment to moment? Do we offer them more cigarettes? What's that tone of voice? What's this tone of voice? Who's in charge here? It was all pretty ad hoc. They did, however, have a psychologist on hand. And I think that was the first time or very nearly the first time that the police had actually brought in a professional, and he's a brilliant man, John Gunn. He's the emeritus professor of clinical um, forensic psychiatry at London University. Um, he provided astonishingly useful insight onto what was going on and what the various actors were doing. But it's interesting, you're right. I mean, it's an oddly ambivalent position to be in, a hostage negotiator, because in some ways you are not privy to all the facts. And in fact, you are deliberately kept blind from some of the facts. So, for example, let me just give you one example. The police negotiators did not know that the conversations inside the building were being overheard through special audio probes drilled into the walls. Now, there was a reason why they were not privy to those conversations, which was that if they were to accidentally let slip in their negotiations with the hostage takers that they knew the hostage takers were being overheard, that would, first of all, completely undermine the nature of their relationship with them. They wouldn't then be able to be completely straight with them, because they knew they would be deceiving them. So the way the negotiation works is that the police negotiators have to keep saying, "Oh, well, I will refer that upwards. I can't promise you anything. I believe in you. I'm on your side. I think you've got a good point there," whether they believed it or not. So they have to sort of be actors. They have to be therapists. They have to be kind of nursemaids. It's a very, very difficult job, and it moves from second to second. And funnily enough, in this case, not funnily enough, rather tragically, really, I mean, some of the police negotiators felt that they had failed utterly. I mean, their job was to try to prevent bloodshed, to try to create a situation where these gunmen and their hostages would all walk out alive. And they didn't achieve that. And arguably, they couldn't achieve that because there was one almighty obstacle to negotiations in this case, I would argue, and that was Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher would not have made a good hostage negotiator. She did not think that way. She did not think in terms of concession and nuance and adaptability and listening. No, those were not her traits. She had other traits, and some of them are very good ones that are brought out in this book. She was resolute. She had absolutely clarity of what she wanted. But she'd made it absolutely clear right from the get-go that these gunmen were not going to get what they wanted. They were not, she was even reluctant to have them broadcast their message on the BBC. She was not going to let them have Arab diplomats, which they wanted, to come and negotiate with them. That was a concession, it seems to me, in hindsight, she could easily have given. It wouldn't have cost anything, really, to have, the Syrian ambassador get on the telephone and actually just simply talk to these people, but she wasn't going to do that. And she definitely was not going to let them get on a plane and fly back to the Middle East, which is right and understandable. But nonetheless, she didn't give the negotiators anything to negotiate with. They couldn't offer anything. All they could offer were, would you like another meal? And can we send some medicines in? In terms of sort of actual negotiating, they didn't have anything to play with, which is why right from really almost from the day two, the highly intelligent leader of the gunmen realized that this was not going to end the way that he thought it was going to end. And then that is where one of the drum beats of mounting tension starts and carries on to its extremely dramatic conclusion.
You mentioned that watching the siege on TV was a kind of formative moment for you, and you've said in other interviews that it was the moment that you realised you wanted to be a reporter. Could you maybe situate that in the kind of story of your early life and when you first became interested in writing and current affairs and history?
Well, that may be me romanticizing the past and sort of seeing significance in things, which we all do, by the way. I mean, that's how memory works. And there was plenty of that in this book, of people sort of looking back and sort of framing the past as if it was inevitable, as if it was an inevitable prelude to the present. But I do think that incident, as it did for many people, was highly dramatic for me. And it was the first time any of us had seen live news reported in that incredibly dramatic way. People actually standing outside the embassy with smoke pouring out of it, saying, it's all going on, it's all taking off here, and that was very formative for me. I'd never seen news portrayed that way up until that point. It had almost always been recorded footage, and you know, heads in the middle of the box telling you what was going on. This was a different kind of news, and I think it did affect me. So I mean, my first job role, I was a publisher for a while, not very successfully, and then only a couple of years, and then I became a journalist, and I think and I've been a journalist ever since. I've been on the Times now for 34 years or something embarrassing. I think the combination of journalism and non-fiction writing has been a wonderful thing for me because the two complement each other. I mean, in some ways, I guess my books have elements of journalism to them, particularly one like this, where there are lots of living witnesses still. There are still people who I can sit down in a room with and ask them, what did it smell like? What did it taste like? What was the expression on her face when she said that? And those are incredibly useful. I mean, they're wonderful ways of writing nonfiction, but it is sort of journalistic in a way. It's not perfect history. It's what we're working on. It's in a way a sort of first draft with all the caveats that come with interviewing living people and the fallibility of memory and all those things that, as a journalist, you have to be fully aware of, that what people are telling you is not necessarily the truth. It is simply their truth. And memory is not truth. Memory is the story that we tell ourselves to make sense of the past, but it's very far from being verifiable history. So that's one of the things you learn as a journalist. So the melding of my journalistic life in a way with my historical life has I've found very fertile, and I really love the way that the sort of daily journalism, and I was a foreign correspondent for years and years in New York and Paris and Washington and other places before that as a sort of rover. Um, the sort of short hit of journalism, the sort of the adrenaline rush of trying to get the story out as fast as possible and as accurately as possible in the time that you have, sort of for me has always sat very comfortably with the sort of longer form job of tackling a big subject over many years and trying to wrestle that down. So the two things bounce off each other, I think.
We also saw, in terms of kind of early informative literary influences, you've mentioned Jane Austen, so this house in Scotland where there was nothing to do except for read Jane Austen, but then also Truman Capote with the caveat that you've raised that there are questions about the factual veracity of In Cold Blood. Tell us about the role that those writers had for you.
Well, I mean, by the way, I still have that house in Scotland, and there's still nothing to do there but read Jane Austen. I mean, that's not true, of course, but it was the place where I buried myself completely in reading because we had no television, and even the radio was rationed in some mad way. So it was that was what we did, and Jane Austen wasn't the only source really, but I really, there was summer after summer. That's what I did. Um, Truman Capote was a real eye opener because In Cold Blood was the first time and in fact, I think it probably is arguably the first, he described it as such, the first non-fiction novel in the sense that it reads like a novel. You hear the inner voices, the inner lives, the thoughts of these people, and yet it purported to be utterly true to life. That he had interviewed everybody, that he was speaking from knowledge of what had gone on. And that what I love about In Cold Blood is that in a way it's quite a humdrum story. I mean, it's not, it's a horrible murder, but multiple murders. But nonetheless, the people involved are incredibly ordinary people. And yet he gets inside their lives in a non-fiction way that read to me exactly like a novel, and a thrilling one at that. It was a source of great sadness to me in later life to discover that he had in fact made some of it up, and that in fact these highly in-depth interviews were probably massaged. That was very depressing to discover that. It's something that I try to be, and I hope I am, completely rigorous about. I sort of feel with narrative nonfiction, if you ever are tempted to embellish or embroider, let alone make up from whole cloth, you are no longer writing history, you're writing a novel. And that's fine, perfectly reasonable thing to do if that's what you want to do, but it has to be labeled as that. So I try to be absolutely rigorous with this. If I say he was wearing a blue shirt and he tripped over the carpet as he walked into the room, that's because I know that happened. That's because I've got, or at least I've got evidence that that happened. So you can't make those things up. And therefore, in a way, I hope readers come to have confidence in the detail. So when something sort of quite unlikely happens, or mad, or even inexplicable happens in my stories, that's because I have evidence that they did. So, for example, there's a sort of absurd moment in the siege, actually, when one of the hostages was released because he snored so loudly. He snored so loudly that he drove all the other hostages and the gunmen completely mad. So when the opportunity came to release someone, they all said, "We'll get rid of that one." Now, if you put it's comic at the time, and but it was, I think, quite comic to the people involved. If you put that in a novel, people would say, "Well, that's ridiculous. That's contrived. I mean, that's not. That's. I mean, that's just incredible. We don't believe that." So that's the lovely thing about putting all the detail in when you know it. The counterpart of that is that if you run out of road on these stories, and that can happen, I'm familiar with this. There are just chunks of every non-fiction story where we don't know what happened. You know, the record goes silent. The diary isn't there. And I think it's important at those moments, and I have done this in several books actually, you have to come clean. You have to say to the reader, we don't know why this happened, or we don't know what happened next, or this is a mystery. And again, I think that's important because I think it cleaves the reader a little closer to you in wanting to turn the next page because I strongly feel that while Truman Capote was a huge influence to me, the discovery that he had in fact made some of this up was a very, very lowering discovery.
I totally agree. It's important to signal when there's a gap in a story and you don't know. At the same time, it must be kind of hard not to frustrate a reader. I mean, there's more than one biography I've picked up in the past, and within the first couple of chapters, we don't know this and we don't know this, and you're like, well, what do you know? And then you end up putting it down. So how do you kind of balance that honesty with making sure the reader still kind of maintains that momentum and follows you into the next bit?
Well, look, I'm very lucky. I write about 20th century history, and there is usually, in the sort of stories I write, enough material to be able to keep the narrative flow going. If I was writing about the 11th century, I wouldn't have. There's just not the detailed warp and weft record that you need. So I guess I'm just very lucky in a way. I work on a combination of archival material, personal material, things that people have gathered, letters, poems, diaries, postcards, photos, those sorts of things, and living people, living witnesses. So when you've got those three elements, and particularly if you're writing about spy stories or military operations and so on, where people do remember them and frequently do keep a record, as I've just said, then you can keep the narrative flow going. It was a piece of advice that I was given many years ago, actually now, by John le Carre, David Cornwell, who was a friend of mine and a bit of a mentor in some ways. And I remember him saying to me once that what we have to do, and he was kind enough to sort of include me in his we, he said, what we have to do is to give the reader a compelling reason to turn the page, to turn every page. And his line was, that's about jeopardy. And I think what he meant was, I know what he meant was not, it didn't mean the sort of obvious jeopardy of will the bomb go off or will the protagonist die or, how exciting is it? But jeopardy in the sense of encouraging the reader to invest in your characters, which is what he did so brilliantly in his novels. And what I have always tried to do in mine, and I think that is a way to balance sometimes the paucity. If you run into the problem of a paucity of material, is to engage your readers for good or ill. They don't have to like the character. They don't, but they have to be engaged in them. So the mere fact that I'm talking about characters is evidence that I use, as it were, novel type techniques. I am building up certain characters and not building up others if I don't find them interesting. I am privileging certain pieces of information if they advance my story and they keep the narrative going and they add to the jeopardy, then they stay in. The cutting floor is covered with stuff that I didn't put in because it didn't interest me and it didn't keep the story going. I mean, my first few books were actually filled with tangents. I mean, I would head off on these, what I thought were terrifically interesting sort of byways and tributaries of my main story. And I think I lost most of my readers in the journey because I would go off on something that happened to interest me, but it wasn't adding to it wasn't bringing the story along. So it's got to move along. Otherwise we lose them.
Just kind of expanding on some of those points you've been discussing, with dialogue, what's your approach to sourcing that? Because I know, that there's, particularly in the Siege bit, but elsewhere, there's a lot of dialogue there. So how do you go about reconstructing that? And then also, you've got, a list of sources, but you haven't got kind of traditional footnotes per particular paragraph and things. What's the decision making behind those two aspects of putting it together?
Well, let me take those separately. I mean, reconstructing, I'm the word reconstructing alarms me slightly because it sounds like I am actually constructing these conversations, that I'm somehow imagining them and then putting them on the page. I'm not. When I do dialogue, that is because I have a report of it, and that comes from people who are writing it down at the time. In this case, the conversations were actually being recorded from outside. Um, Police were listening in and noting down and translating if they had to as this was going along. They were also having conversations with each other. Those were also being noted. Telephone conversations between the Cobra Emergency Committee room and Zulu headquarters, which was where the siege was being run from. Those were also being recorded. So these are real conversations. They're not made up. They're not reconstructed exactly. And in fact, I had more conversations, more dialogue than I could really use, because there's so much of it. And then, as I say, I had these records written by people at the time, noting down the conversations they'd had. Now they were reconstructing, of course. They would sometimes immediately afterwards, sometimes a considerable time afterwards, they would be writing down what they remembered of a conversation. That is reconstruction. I wasn't doing reconstruction. I was sort of, as it were, always take notes. I was taking notes from theirs. Um, so forgive me. What was the second part of your question?
The footnotes.
I mean, I used to laboriously, every time I quoted anyone, add a sort of citation at the end of the book, and they were beginning to take up so many trees and so much space at the back, and I wasn't ever convinced that people ever really looked at them. I think it was that they were there as a kind of prop in a way. So I haven't done those detailed footnotes, but what I do is a detailed sort of source notes for each chapter. So as each chapter at the back, after each chapter, I give details of where to find these things if you need to find them. I mean, I think increasingly the way to do this is probably, rather than clogging up a hardback book, which already costs so much with pages and pages of footnotes, is probably to put them all online. I think that is probably the way to do it, so that scholars can, if they wish to, or skeptics can, if they wish to, go and consult the record and find out where everything comes from. But I think definitely footnotes on the page, I think, clog up a narrative nonfiction story like this. You have to, as I've said before, you have to drag the reader in, and if their eyes are constantly having to flip to the bottom of the page to find out where it comes from, that's a very jolting, disjointing, slowing experience, I think, for the reader. So a long time ago, I gave up footnotes at the bottom of the page in favor of citations, and now I've kind of moved away from those to sort of source notes, detailed source notes at the back. I mean, not everyone agrees with it. There are purists who feel that every word should be footnoted. But that's fine. That's a different sort of history.
The internet feels like a nice compromise there. To roll back as well to your chronology, you were approached by security services after university. Had you been interested in the spy world before that point, or was it sort of alighted with that tap on the shoulder?
I think everyone's interested in the spy world, thank God. Otherwise, my sales would be going down. But it's no, I think people love all that. I was always interested in it. It wasn't the security service, by the way. It was MI6. It was the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service. Yeah, I mean, I was tapped up in an utterly conventional way, or it was at least conventional for that time. Yeah, my one of my tutors at university said, there are parts of the Foreign Office that are not the same as the other parts of the Foreign Office, in the sense that they are different from the Foreign Office. So it was one of those sort of mad conversations. Didn't actually really tell me what he was. I knew exactly what he was talking about, but he never actually said it. And then I was contacted. A brown envelope popped through into my pigeonhole at Cambridge, and off I trotted to go and see them. I mean, I did it more for fun, I have to admit now, than with any real expectation that I would join the intelligence service. But I did find it fascinating, and I didn't go very far in the process, but I continued talking to them for some time. But it was sort of realized, I think, by both sides that I lack, as I've just demonstrated, I lack one of the essential qualifications for being a spy, which is that I can't keep a secret. Also, I wanted to be a journalist where the whole point is that you don't keep secrets, you reveal them. And I've always found that much more satisfying as a way of life. But I mean, look, I mean, the intelligence services are a fascinating canvas to paint these stories on, partly because, they raise all sorts of interesting questions about, in a way, not to be too pompous, but the sort of human condition, because they're about loyalty and love and betrayal and adventure and romance and all those subjects that novelists normally commandeer. And if you can tell them in a non-fiction way, that gives them, I think, real heft and purchase. So, but yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by the secret world. I think we all have a sort of interest in the secret world. I think the idea of appearing to be one thing on the outside, but actually being something completely different on the inside is a human fascination. I think we all like that thought. James Bond works on the principle that he looks like one thing, but he's actually something else. Actually, he's not even a spy, James Bond. He's an assassin, so he doesn't really count. But I think that world does appeal to us, and it's endlessly interesting because it does involve double lives and duplicity at its very heart.
Attention listeners of Always Take Notes. We're doing a series of live events this summer and we'd love to see you there. Next up is Frank Close, a theoretical physicist and the author of Trinity and Elusive. His new book, Destroyer of Worlds, is a history of the nuclear age. We'll be chatting to him at EA Festival on June 15th.
And finally, on July 3rd, we'll be speaking to Jesse Armstrong at the London Library. Jesse is the multi-award-winning screenwriter behind Peep Show, The Thick of It, and Succession.
Go to alwaystakenotes.com to buy tickets and find out more.
Operation Mincemeat comes out in 2010. It's this huge hit. But we were interested to see that you'd written this at 7 or 8 books before that. That you've alluded to this earlier, but you had a kind of long career before that. Can you tell us a bit about that time before, your sales had gone up, you're being read very widely? You've mentioned a bit that you learned about structure, but what was the experience of writing those early books like?
Well, my first book was a book called Forgotten Fatherland. Now, here's a memo to any aspiring writers. If you're going to write a book, don't put forgotten in the title, because sure enough, that is what it becomes one day. I loved writing it, but it was a slightly mad book. It was about Elizabeth Nietzsche, who was the sister of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who had set off to the jungles of Paraguay in the 1880s to set up a sort of ghastly Aryan vegetarian community in the jungle. It was completely mad. And I went in search of what remained of this tribe of white people living in the jungle. And it was a strange book because it couldn't work out really. It was very much a young man's book. It couldn't work out whether it was a travel book. It had sort of Bruce Chatwin sort of echoing on every page, whether it was a sort of second-rate Bruce Chatwin or a book about philosophy or a book of history or something, it was a book about Nazis. It was everything really. It was a bit of a sprawl, but I loved it. I had such fun with it. And then I kind of dotted around a bit. I wrote a book about a character who operated in Afghanistan in the early 19th century. He was the model for the man who would be king in the Rudyard Kipling stories, and he was a real character. The problem with that is what we were talking about just earlier, is that I lacked enough material. There was simply not I couldn't reconstruct his world with sufficient detail to make it work for me, and that was another early one. I wrote one about the First World War, which I loved doing. It was about a sort of love story that took place behind the lines. But again, there was a lack of material there, and I found myself stretching really to try and fill it all in. And the breakthrough for me was actually before Operation Mincemeat. It was a book called Agent Zigzag, which was the story of a Second World War criminal called Eddie Chapman, who had been recruited by the Germans to spy for them and then parachuted into Britain during the war and immediately defected to the other side. He was a tremendously bad person and awfully good fun and very wicked. And they called him Zigzag because they could never quite work out whose side he was on. And he ended up actually as the crime correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, which I particularly like. He kind of got away with it all his life, and he was one of those wonderful rogues. But I was able to write that really because MI5, and this was pretty revolutionary for the time. MI5 had begun by then to declassify its archives, or some of them. It was a real change in our attitudes towards official secrecy in this country. It was the first time that those organizations had ever been able to produce their material, and the Zigzag files are extraordinary because they're incredibly voluminous. For one thing, they stand about 6 feet high. I mean, if you pile them all up, they're huge, and they're absolutely wonderful because unlike most government records, they're completely true. And by that, what I mean is they're written by and for people who never expected them ever to be made public. And so, therefore, instead of covering up or trying to obfuscate or, not filling in the record properly, when it goes wrong, and it always goes wrong at some point in intelligence work, they actually write in the margins, we are completely done here. And they don't use that kind of language either. So, so you really get a sense of what is happening in the spy world. Those files were absolute catnip for me. They were just wonderful. And they contained everything. They had Chapman's poems and his diaries and photographs and all the different people who'd been involved in his case and the various zigs and zags that he'd made over his incredibly checkered I've mixed checkers and chess now, but I mean, it was a really complicated, fun, mad, and yet actually very important intelligence story that had never been told before. That set me off on the road of digging my way into these stories. And Operation Mincemeat followed. And then the sort of third part of that trilogy, which is the story of the double cross spies, who were the double agents who were recruited by British intelligence to plant the D-Day deception, the great deception that sent Hitler the wrong way on D-Day and saved many, many, probably thousands of lives as a result. Almost certainly changed the course of the Second World War, probably the greatest masterpiece of organized deception ever carried out. And again, that comes from the files. And at that point, it was some time ago now, there were still living witnesses. There were people who could tell me, alas, I fear they've all gone now, but who were able to tell me what it was like. And that was wonderful, wonderfully useful too.
It sounds like a intensive reporting and research process. What were your journalistic responsibilities while you were putting those books together, and how did you balance the two kind of aspects of your career?
Well, I probably shouldn't say this because it gives away some of the game, but I was a foreign correspondent, and particularly when I was in America, my journalistic day started very early in the morning. But it also, in those days, before sort of pre-internet, most of it, it also meant my day more or less ended by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So then I could sit down and remain at my desk and scribble away at my other books. But the newspaper has always been incredibly supportive of the books. I think they rather enjoy them and rather like the fact that the books may be serialized in the paper and so on. And they're almost always they produce some news stories, some elements of immediate journalism for today that sort of works as well. So balancing was tricky. I mean, I do less journalism these days. I still do a column, but I do less reporting than I used to because the books have somewhat sort of taken over these days.
With writers who've had big hits in whatever genre, we always find it very interesting to ask what they think made a book take off, and it's often very difficult, even in retrospect, to say. But with that moment with Zigzag and later with Mincemeat, when they really skyrocketed, what do you think drove that?
Such a good question, Simon. I think it was probably. Look, I inherited, as most people of my sort of vintage did, a rather black and white view of the war. And I mean that literally as well, because, the black and white films that we all watched on a Sunday afternoon throughout the sort of 70s and 80s told a very simple moral tale about the war. That it was about goodies and baddies and heroes and villains, and the goodies won and the villains lost, and that's the way life should be. And of course, that's partly true, but actually, that's not really the way life works. And it's not the way war works, and it's definitely not the way spies work. Because what I loved about Zigzag, and what I think made it quite appealing for people, was that this was a story about a bad man, effectively, who had ended up almost inadvertently doing something very, very good. Something that almost in spite of himself, he found a sort of reservoir of courage and conviction and patriotism that really had a dramatic effect on the war. And so I think he, for me anyway, he bucked that rather plastic view of the past as a kind of moral fable, that it's all, it's all there to teach us lessons about the way people should behave and the way they shouldn't behave and so on. I always think that's rather a didactic and limiting way of looking at the past. Actually, the past is full of people who do good by mistake, or who are bad inadvertently, or have to make really difficult moral choices in circumstances over which they have absolutely no control. And for me, that's the kind of essence. That's what I'm fascinated by, is what do ordinary people do in extraordinary circumstances? And there is no guarantee, whatever those black and white films might tell you about, British patriotism and daring do and stiff upper lippery. You don't know. You just don't know until you're plunged into one of these situations how you're going to react. So I think that was probably, in a way, certainly for me, that was the discovery that was a bit of a breakthrough, that I could write about these stories without feeling shackled by a kind of post-war need to bang the drum in a particular way and try to persuade people or convince people that the war had been a jolly good thing and well worth fighting. So I think in a way we have just a much more sophisticated view of the past now, and we're able to look at these stories without having to see them through a sort of strict nationalist or ethical lens, if you like. And that was fun. I liked that. I liked being able to say there are some really dodgy people out there who did some extraordinary things.
Well, that takes us on quite nicely to SAS Rogue Heroes. Can you tell us a little bit about how that project came about, and again, how you put it together with all the different research elements that it required?
Well, that was the only time I've ever written a book by invitation. That was the first and only time that somebody has come along to me and said, look, here's an opportunity. Normally, you get occasionally people say that and one's heart sinks. But in this case, this was the SAS themselves who had decided, and I applaud them for this, that because the events of the war for the SAS were at that point on the furthest tip of living memory, there were just a tiny handful of people left. The last one died last year, actually, at the age of 104, who had been involved in this story. And they wanted, I think, to pay tribute to them. And I think that was rather admirable in a way. And I think they felt that the story of the SAS in the war was a discrete chapter that could be told on its own without infringing, official secrecy or breaking the sort of the convention of not talking about these events. So I was invited to go into the SAS archives, the secret archives, which no historian had been allowed into before. I can't even tell you, I'm not allowed to tell you where they are, in fact, but that was fantastic. I mean, those archives are wonderful because, I mean, most people when they hear the word archive imagine sort of rows of dusty shelves, everything tightly bound and with a catalogue and so on. That's not what the SAS archives are like. They're just a bunch of filing cabinets that people have thrown everything into. Because one of the odd things about being in the SAS is that, of course, these people did keep records. They told their own stories to themselves and their families. And then often when they died, they simply bequeathed them to the SAS Regimental Association, who put them in filing cabinets. And there they have sat ever since, unread until yours truly was allowed to go fossicking through them. And they're great because they contain all sorts of stuff. I mean, they're not just official documents about what was really being done. They contain the lovely sort of minutiae of life, letters and diaries and poems, postcards, all sorts of different bits and pieces that families very often have gathered up when a member of their family has died and simply sent them off to the regiment. So that was fantastically good. I felt very sorry actually for. I mean, they were rather paranoid that I would try and look at some of the other files because my rules were very strict that I was not allowed to go beyond the wartime years, and that there were other files in that collection that did go beyond that. There's some poor soul who I expect had probably signed up to strangle people in Libya had to kind of stand over me quite a lot of the time, making sure that I wasn't looking in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the SAS was incredibly cooperative, and I think, goodness knows, I think they're very happy with the way that that story has spooled out, because as some of your listeners will know, it's been turned into a TV adaptation. SAS Rogue Heroes. Now the second season has been completed. I think it's very likely there'll be a third one. And the SAS, on the whole, I mean, I shouldn't speak for all of them because I'm sure some of them have objections to it. Most of them are very happy with the way that that story is portrayed. And I am too, because I think what the TV series does, and this is where I really applaud it, is that while it does dramatize it, there are embedded characters, dialogue is embedded and so on, it does do what I try to do in the book, which is that this is not a glamorization of war. In fact, on the contrary, these people, everyone suffers in this story. The soldiers, the civilians, the men, women, the families, the bystanders. War is horrendous, and particularly this kind of really tough, behind the lines, hand to hand war, if you like, is very, very bad for people. It creates, nobody comes out of it unscarred and unscathed. And I think what Steve Knight does in the series, and definitely what I try to do in the book, is to try and tell the story of that particular kind of warfare. And it is really daggers drawn. It's at times it's absolutely stomach turning what they did and what they felt they had to do. But it is real. It's not made up. So I think I think up until that point, what had been written about the SAS during the war had been about sort of daring do, gung ho, kind of shoot 'em up stuff. And there is a lot of that, obviously. But actually, that's not the whole story. I don't know. I don't know if readers know this, but I mean, some of those characters are borderline mentally ill. There are situations where they are behaving and being thrust into impossible circumstances, and you see really the very nasty side of war as well throughout it. So the SAS story is not one of unalloyed glory and heroism, despite the title. These are not just rogues. Sometimes it goes terribly badly wrong.
You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation when we were first talking about the SAS that you had some kind of wariness about this idea of an authorized book, and I was wondering, in the time since you've written Rogue Heroes with the adaptations, as you say, it's very clear that your focus stopped in 1945, but that last 8 years or so has seen this kind of raft of allegations about the SAS in Afghanistan, and particularly what they have been up to there. And it seems it's kind of almost a kind of curious moment in the culture, in that there's this huge international adaptation of your book, but at the other time there is major question marks about the behaviour of the institution in recent conflict. And I thought it was actually looking at the siege, that these themes about, do you take prisoners, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's a completely different situation. They're not like leaving weapons on corpses or stuff like that. But you can see some of the same threads that have come through more recently run back that far. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
Well, I suppose it is. I mean, I'm very, very cautious of saying and anything about the modern SAS because I don't really know about it, and I think it's really not my purview really. But you know, if you're fighting this kind of war, you are thrust into situations where you have to make very swift, very, very difficult choices. I mean, the siege is a very good case in point. There is still some controversy surrounding, and I don't want to give away too much for the readers because I hope some of them will read it. But um, about the closing moments of that story, just exactly what the soldiers had been ordered to do, um, how much there was a sort of they were encouraged to take prisoners and how much they were encouraged just simply to get the hostages out. I'm absolutely convinced that in the end their orders were pretty clear. You're not going in there necessarily to kill people, but if you have to kill people to fulfill your primary duty, which is saving these hostages, then that is what you will have to do. If you come across somebody with a gun and they're not surrendering and they haven't obviously put the gun down, you can do what you have to do. But I don't think it was ever made explicit, which is why I think these stories have a grey area. They just do. There is a sort of element in the middle of them that is very, very hard to read. They were not given explicit orders either way.
It's a rule of the show that we ask every guest about money. So tell us as much or as little as you'd like, but how has it worked over the course of your career and maybe in the kind of latter period in particular with all these film and TV adaptations? How has the money side of your writing career worked?
Well, look, the first, how many have I done now? 16. I'd say for the first half of the books made absolutely nothing at all and barely kind of scraped through and were incredible fun to write, but I definitely wasn't doing it for the money because there wasn't any. Um, Latterly, yes, it's been extraordinary. I mean, rather life-changing in some ways that these things have, some of them, been picked up, and I feel incredibly privileged and slightly amazed. I mean, I got used to the idea that, the books would be optioned from time to time. And then I would get incredibly overexcited and I would start casting them and deciding who would, I'd like Martin Scorsese to direct, and obviously I'm going to have Tom Cruise in the main part. And I'd get totally overexcited, and then of course absolutely nothing would happen. And that was really the pattern, and I got completely used to that and assumed that that's really what happened. You just sort of sat there and got very overexcited and paid a little bit of money for the option, and then it all just dwindled away. And then just about 5 or 6 years ago, it suddenly started to change, and it suddenly really started to pick up. And I think it was partly to do with the way that the sort of books I write somehow suddenly seem to merge with the sort of visual culture in some way. And I wonder if that meant, I still haven't quite worked this out myself, whether I began to write in a more visual way, in a way that was sort of slightly more graphic and easy to visualize. I don't know. But yes, so it has become much more profitable, and that's been absolutely wonderful. I don't think it's particularly changed the way I approach it. I do a book every other year. I have a routine. I spend a year researching more or less, and then I spend a year writing very intensively, usually up in Scotland in the place stuffed with Jane Austen books. And that's a wonderful rhythm for me. I don't think I'd advise. I mean, the money is lovely, but it hasn't really sort of changed anything very much in the way that I approach these things. So yeah, I mean, it's lovely. I wouldn't advise anybody to go into narrative nonfiction thinking it's going to make their fortune, because it doesn't, or at least it doesn't for a very long time, and then you have to get incredibly lucky. So there's absolutely no guarantee, I don't think.
So a final question from me would be about how your readership breaks down internationally, because many of your stories are, if not very British, have very strong British roots about British institutions. So how does your readership work internationally, and how does their reaction to the books compare to the domestic one?
Well, it's very interesting, Simon. I mean, they do very well internationally. I mean, particularly in America, where some of them have been astonishingly bestsellers, even though they are not only just British stories, but in some cases, I mean, for example, The Spy and the Traitor, which is a book about Oleg Gordievsky, who was a KGB spy. The villains in that, in a way, are Americans, and yet somehow it's still sold incredibly well in America, to my astonishment. So I think these stories have a kind of universality that sort of is really, in a way, nothing to do with where they come from. I mean, they are British in origin, some of them, not all of them. But it's odd, that sort of breakdown. I mean, the books do well in Germany, interestingly enough. I wrote a book called Agent Sonia, which was about a German-born communist spy who ended up in Britain, but most of her life was spent in the Far East or in Switzerland or in Germany. And that had a sort of strange sort of international release. So it's odd. And even this, I mean, even my Cold War books, oddly enough, which you would, so I wrote a book about Kim Philby, about whom I have very strong feelings, Kim Philby. And yet that book, oddly, even though Kim Philby is a hero in Russia, sold very well in Russian. So I think these stories sort of, in a way, transcend the kind of national boundary in some way. They're kind of stories about everybody, if that makes any sense. And I think that sort of explains why they have been so sort of widely translated.
You've preempted my final question, which was going to be about the reception of your books in Russia, particularly the books that involve kind of KGB missteps like The Spy and the Traitor and things like that. Do you have a sense of how some of the other books have played out there?
I think the only ones that have been translated into Russian are the last three or 4, in fact. And I believe actually they're quite popular even with the former KGB types who are involved in them. I mean, when I was researching the Gordievsky story, I spoke to quite a number of former KGB officers who were incredibly helpful with this story. They just happened to see it through the other end of the telescope. Their line is pretty straightforward. They say, "Your Kim Philby is our Oleg Gordievsky. We regard him as a traitor." We all knew that the Soviet Union was falling apart. We didn't all, betray our friends for a pound of gold, which is the way they would see it. It's not quite true, but no, it's interesting. I think they do have a sort of purchase in. I think partly because the files I was accessing would not be available to Russian researchers, and so therefore it gives them another angle on Philby. Particularly the Cambridge Five, who are considered to be great heroes in Russia. On the outside of the FSB is a large plaque with Kim Philby on it. So they're very aware of their British history. It's one of the reasons why I've always doubted this sort of long-running conspiracy theory that Roger Hollis, who went on to become head of MI5, was a Soviet spy. There's been a long conspiracy theory that he was somehow recruited and protecting the others. Well, I don't believe that, for the simple reason that had he been a deep mine Soviet spy, I don't think Vladimir Putin would have been able to resist telling us about it. And opening up the archives to some tame historian and saying, this is the man we had buried in British intelligence. So it just shows how interested they are in that story.
Well, look, Ben, thank you for a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, and wishing you all the very best with The Siege and with your numerous other projects going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Ben Macintyre. He's on Twitter at BenMacintyre1, and The Siege is published by Penguin Viking. Before we get on with the rest of the outro, we have another Patreon to thank. This is Katie Forrest, who's been supporting us on the crowdfunding platform. Katie says, "I write cosy mysteries as Mona Marple, but the book that would be most appropriate to mention on the show would be my non-fiction book released as Katie Forrest's Time Management for Writers." She says, "I love the show, it's so inspirational and always puts me in the mood to get back to the writing desk." Katie, we really appreciate your support for Always Take Notes. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Ben?
I thought Ben was a great interviewee. He was both fun and informative. It was one of those conversations where there's just such a wealth of material to talk about. It's hard to cover it all in the time. But I thought Ben was interesting on the topic of writing history and the rigour that is required to do so, and also the kind of complexities of negotiating with sources such as the Ministry of Defence, which of course you have some experience with as well. How about you?
I also thought it was a very interesting interview. I think the thing that stuck with me is actually something that has come up numerous times on the show, which is that writers who have a huge public profile and are very, very successful, there often has been this like lengthy warm-up or apprenticeship. So he'd written numerous books before he broke out into the big time, and I think that can get missed when you're looking at it from the outside. And so I think it's very helpful in these conversations to really get a sense that this kind of success does not come out of nowhere and is often a reflection of years of grafting. And yeah, I thought it was interesting his thoughts on kind of the position of the SAS in British popular culture. Obviously a kind of hot button topic at the moment, given some of the stuff that's been coming out about Afghanistan. And yeah, that kind of broader idea of like where the Second World War sits in the British subconscious and how we relate and negotiate with it. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
Well, we have just got back, I say just, recently got back from Hay Festival, where we were interviewing Jojo Moyes, and we also interviewed Jacqueline Wilson. So it was quite the departure from our usual Zoom interviewing, in that we were in front of 500 people, which I think you and I were both a little bit daunted by, but we got to wear Britney headsets, so that was quite fun. And yes, people can listen out for those episodes, which are coming very soon. And outside of that, I have just been trucking along with the section. I've been pulling together our best books of the year so far list, so anyone looking for summer reading can look there. Did you see the recent thing, Simon, about a publication that had used ChatGPT to help with such a list?
I did not, no.
The AI had made up titles, so people wrote in to say, I think it's like Isabella Land had not written that book, which is quite funny. But I can vouch that there was a lot of human endeavour behind ours.
It's all been a hand on the tiller. Hay was amazing actually, and they're great conversations. I think that'll be excellent episodes as well. As you say, it was a kind of intimidating thing for us to do, but I think it went very well. And there is always this thing that we always find that, you know, when you do an interview in front of an audience, it is different because there is a performative element from the guests quite naturally and quite understandably, rather than we often tend to do our conversation on video calls, which are kind of anti-glamorous and but conducive to candor. So it's a different thing. It's not better or worse, just different. But I think Jojo and Jacqueline were excellent guests and a lot to look into there. In terms of matters cultural, I read a couple of magazine pieces, as I try and do every weekend. So I read Michael Pollan on religious people taking hallucinogens in the New Yorker, and a very powerful piece by Katie Engelhardt in the New York Times Magazine about assisted dying in Canada. And I'm continuing to read this book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig, that was a kind of huge hit in the 1970s, and I think might have some stuff that will be useful for me for my current book, which I'm about to submit. So a sort of busy time all in. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can follow us on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on the crowdfunding page Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.